The letter was written in pencil, on a single sheet of Wehrmacht field stationery, somewhere in the Bocage south of the Wehr River, in the second week of July, 1944. The officer who wrote it was a regimental commander, a professional soldier who had served in Poland through the fall of France in 1940 and across 2 years of the Eastern Front. He had been under Soviet artillery on the steppes south of Kharkov. He had written home before about what it meant to stand inside a barrage. This letter was different. His son, who kept it in a shoebox for 30 years before giving it to a Veterans Association in the 1970s, would say later that his father almost never described the physical experience of combat in personal correspondence. In this letter, he could not seem to stop. The officer wrote that American artillery was unlike anything he had encountered in 5 years of war. He described shells arriving in clusters so large they seemed to press the air itself flat. He wrote about veteran soldiers from his battalion, men who had held positions at Stalingrad, who refused to leave their holes when the American guns opened. He wrote one sentence that his son could still recite from memory 40 years later. The Americans do not fight with soldiers at the front. They fight with mathematics behind the lines. If this story is pulling you in, take a second to hit the like button and subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. It means a great deal to know who's listening. That specific letter has not been located in any archive that can be identified. What survives is the pattern. Across the German 7th Army War Diaries, the after-action reports of 3 panzer divisions committed to the Normandy front, the post-war testimony of surviving senior commanders collected by the United States Army Historical Division in 1945, and the private correspondence of officers whose families later donated papers to German regimental associations, the same observation appears. These were men with no reason to coordinate their accounts and every professional reason to be accurate, because the people reading their reports needed honest information to make decisions. The documents describe the American artillery system at St. Lo with a consistency that is not explained by coincidence. What the Germans encountered in the Bocage in July 1944 was the product of a system they had no existing doctrine to counter and no industrial capacity to match. To understand what their officers wrote, the material reality of American artillery by that summer requires examination, as does what the German army had expected to find when the Allies came ashore. German artillery doctrine in 1944 was built around precision and economy. A battery would identify a target, compute a firing solution, deliver a concentrated strike, and relocate before counter-battery response could land. The Wehrmacht had refined this method across 4 years of combat in multiple theaters. It worked. German artillery, at its best, was accurate, tactically responsive, and well integrated with infantry operations. But the system rested on a scarcity assumption embedded in German planning at every level. The Wehrmacht's logistical structure could not sustain prolonged, high-volume fire missions across an extended campaign. Every round expended had to be manufactured, transported, and accounted for. Waste was a command failure. The Germans assumed that any enemy operating at comparable scale would face the same material constraints. It was a defensible assumption in 1941. By July 1944, it was costing them the campaign. The United States was producing 105mm howitzer ammunition in 1944 at rates that German planners had not fully incorporated into their campaign assessments. Standard American infantry divisions in Normandy each carried 3 organic artillery battalions, every battalion equipped with 12 105 howitzers capable of reaching targets roughly 7 miles distant. Above divisional artillery sat corps-level assets, 155mm howitzers and heavier pieces, available for massing against any point a corps commander designated. The total fire support accessible to a single American infantry division during an active operation could, measured in rounds per hour, equal or exceed the output of an entire German corps on the same day. The Americans had solved the production problem, the shipping problem, and the distribution problem across 3 years of preparation. What arrived in Normandy was a logistical system in uniform, and the guns at its front had more ammunition available than any German counter-battery planner had calibrated a response for. German military intelligence had access to American defense production statistics published openly in the American press through 1942. The figures were not classified in the United States. the American government publicized production milestones as a matter of national morale. Analysts at Fremde Heere West, the section responsible for assessing Western Allied capabilities, examined these reports. Their assessments, which survive in captured document collections of the National Archives in Washington, consistently modeled American production growth at lower rates than actually occurred and assumed that shipping finished munitions across an ocean to a war theater would impose supply limitations on frontline artillery comparable to German constraints. Neither assumption proved accurate. The analysis was not the product of negligence. It was the product of a planning system that had no institutional frame of reference for industrial output at that scale operating across that distance, because no European army had ever been sustained from a production base remotely like it. The commander of the 84th Corps, General der Infanterie Dietrich von Koltitz, wrote in his operational diary for early July that his corps was consuming casualties at a rate that German replacement channels could not match, and that the principal cause was not infantry combat but artillery fire in the hours before American attacks began. Koltitz's diary, portions of which were incorporated into post-war German operational histories of the Normandy campaign, describes the artillery preparation as a pre-attack consumption of defending forces that his corps had no tactical response for. His counterattack reserves, he noted, were frequently destroyed by artillery before they could reach the forward positions they were designated to reinforce. The cycle left German frontline units isolated and under strength at the moment American infantry attacked, producing results that looked, from the American side, like a momentum advantage in the assault, and looked from the German side like a systematic reduction of the defensive force before the assault even began. The technique that produced the effect those German officers described was called time on target. Multiple batteries at varying distances from a designated target would calculate firing solutions timed, so their shells, fired at different moments, arrived at the same second. A single battery firing 100 rounds produces 100 sequential impacts. 20 batteries firing the same aggregate total, timed to converge within 2 seconds, produce a different event entirely. No warning reaches the target area, because the first round and the last are, from the perspective of anyone below, the same round. Everyone inside the impact zone is struck at once, before any movement is possible, before a runner can carry a warning, before the first impact signals to a man in a hedgerow that something is incoming. Survivors of time-on-target missions in Normandy describe the experience, on those occasions when they describe it at all, in terms that standard military reporting does not typically contain. American artillery battalions had been training in time-on-target coordination since 1942. The calculations required a reliable radio net, accurate survey data for gun positions, and a fire direction center capable of running simultaneous firing solutions for multiple batteries in real time. The United States Army had built all three. The SCR-608 radio sets carried by artillery liaison officers attached to infantry battalions gave direct communication to battery fire direction centers and through them to division artillery headquarters, where a single fire request could be relayed to every battery in range within minutes. German forward observers working with equivalent infantry units operated communications equipment that, by 1944, was in many cases a generation behind in radio capability and significantly slower in the procedural chain from observation to round on target. The German 7th Army's own communications assessments, filed in the war diary held today at the Bundesarchivmilitararchiv in Freiburg, note repeatedly across June and July that American artillery response times, from initial fire request to first round, were shorter than German counter-battery doctrine had trained against. The practical consequence of that speed was visible in every German counter-battery log from the Normandy front. German artillery doctrine called for counter-battery fire to begin within 2 to 3 minutes of observing an enemy battery discharge, to catch the crew before they could displace. Against American divisional artillery in Normandy, German counter-battery rounds arrived, when they arrived at all, after the batteries they targeted had ceased firing and repositioned. The after-action reports of American artillery battalions in Normandy record counter-battery responses under the heading Hostile Fire Received. The entries from mid-July are brief. They consistently note that German counter-battery fire arrived after the mission was complete and the battery had displaced. The German side of this exchange appears in the 7th Army War Diary as repeated requests from Corps artillery officers for more ammunition to support counter-battery work, requests that could not be fulfilled from available stocks on multiple dates. A second capability had entered the picture that German tactical planners had not modeled. The VT Fuze, designated the M48 in American service, used a small radio transmitter embedded in the shell's nose to detect proximity to a solid surface and initiate detonation at roughly 20 to 60 feet above the ground. A shell that explodes at ground level buries a substantial fraction of its fragmentation in the earth below. A shell that detonates 20 feet above a trench line sends fragments downward and outward through the position beneath it. German troops in the Bocage had spent weeks cutting fighting positions into the thick earthen hedgerows that bordered every Norman field, positions that deflected direct fire and most ground-level shell bursts. Those same positions gave limited protection against an airburst timed to detonate above rather than beside them. American commanders restricted the VT Fuze's employment against ground targets until December 1944, using it against aerial targets from 1942 onward, and releasing it for surface use during the Ardennes campaign. Selective use of proximity-fused ammunition against German troop concentrations in Normandy had already produced results that German after-action reports recorded without identifying the mechanism behind them. The 29th Infantry Division's fire plan for the attack of July 11, 1944, toward the approaches to St. Lo, is preserved in the division's operational files at the National Archives in College Park, Maryland. The plan coordinated the fires of 3 artillery battalions, 36 105 howitzers, against identified German positions along the regimental axis of advance, firing time-on-target sequences over a preparation of roughly 30 minutes. Each battery's time of fire is offset from the others by seconds. The targeting data came from aerial observation and from ground liaison officers who had spent the preceding days locating German positions in the hedgerow lines. The German formation holding that ground was the 352nd Infantry Division, which had been in continuous combat since before dawn on June 6. Its own after-action reports, captured when its headquarters was overrun in late July and now in the same National Archives collection, describe American fire preparations on successive days as events that no adjustment of position or dispersal of forces could mitigate, because the volume of fire was sufficient to cover multiple dispersal options simultaneously. The language is spare and administrative. The conclusion it reaches is the same conclusion that appears in the private letters. The German force defending that ground was not inadequate. The fire that struck, it was simply beyond any proportionate response the 7th Army could generate. In the field, between those barrages, German infantry continued to fight with considerable effectiveness in the hedgerow terrain. The Bocage, with its dense earthen banks and narrow lanes, reduced the American advantages in armor and air support and consistently favored the defender. German counterattacks in the days following American assaults recovered ground repeatedly and at significant cost to the attacking formations. American casualty rates in the hedgerow fighting were higher than pre-invasion planners had projected, and the pace of the advance was slower than the optimistic forecasts made before the landing. The letters written by German officers in those same days do not suggest demoralization. They suggest a specific and professional recognition that one element of the battlefield equation had no solution available to the German side. What makes that body of evidence worth examining carefully is that the formations producing it were not, by any standard of the war, losing soldiers. The 352nd Infantry Division had held its position at Omaha Beach for 6 weeks against the best assault troops the Allies had put ashore and was still fighting as a formed unit in mid-July. The 12th SS Panzer Division had fought the Canadian 2nd Division to a standstill across most of June and July in the sector east of Caen. These formations could fight, and their officers knew it. The letters do not say otherwise. They say something more specific, that the system confronting them had removed the connection between individual steadiness and collective result. A man could hold his position with everything he had and still be reduced by fire he had no means of stopping or answering. That recognition, appearing in different handwriting across dozens of letters and official reports, is the thread that runs through the Normandy archive. The German 74th Corps after-action report for the second week of July, 1944, notes that casualties from American artillery fire were disproportionately high given the terrain and the quality of German field fortifications, and that standard protective positions appeared to offer reduced cover in American-supported sectors. The report attributes this to possible observed flat trajectory fire adjusted by aerial observation. The mechanism behind the disproportionate casualties is not identified because it was not visible to anyone on the receiving end. If this is the kind of history you want more of, subscribe and turn on notifications. There's far more in the record still to cover. Your support is what keeps these stories coming. The testimony that gives this account its most specific human texture comes from General Fritz Bayerlein, commander of the Panzerlehr Division, interviewed by the United States Army Historical Division in 1945. The transcript is held at the Army Heritage and Education Center in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. Panzerlehr was among the elite formations the Wehrmacht committed to Normandy, a division built around veteran tank crews and fully motorized panzer grenadiers, rated as one of the best-equipped formations in the German order of battle in the West. Bayerlein had led it from North Africa through the Normandy fighting and survived to give an extensive post-war account. He described the American artillery preparation preceding Operation Cobra on July 25, 1944, as the most destructive concentration of firepower he had witnessed in the entire war. This was a man who had commanded armor at El Alamein. He said that when the preparation lifted and he went forward to assess his division's positions, he found that those positions no longer existed in any military sense. The hedgerows remained. The fields remained. The men and equipment that had occupied the ground had been converted into something that could not be reconstituted. He estimated his division had lost approximately 70% of effective combat strength before a single American rifleman crossed his line of departure. His unit's after-action paperwork, collected by American intelligence officers following his later capture, is consistent with those figures. What Bayerlein told his interviewer about his surviving officers speaks directly to the letters written across the 7th Army's front. He said that after the Cobra preparation, the battalion commanders who could still move came forward, and he asked each of them to describe their unit's condition. The answers, he said, did not use the language of military reporting. They described what their men had experienced in terms he associated with accounts of the First War, of men at the Somme or before Verdun who had endured prolonged drum fire. The German term for that experience was Trommelfeuer. It was understood to belong to 1916. Bayerlein had read those accounts as a young officer, studying the previous war's battles. He recognized the vocabulary his battalion commanders were reaching for. What those officers described that afternoon told him that the American artillery system had recreated the phenomenon, at a volume, and with a targeting precision his division had no answer for. The private letters from the Bocage present the same recognition in a different register. German Feldpost correspondence was subject to censorship, but the censorship grew more imperfect as the summer of 1944 pressed forward. Officers writing to family members were generally less scrutinized than enlisted correspondents. What survives in regimental association archives, family collections, and institutions such as the Deutsches Tagebucharchiv in Emmendingen shows officers in Normandy reaching for language adequate to what they were experiencing. A collection of letters from officers of the 2nd Panzer Division, assembled in a 1983 regimental history, describes American artillery preparations preceding attacks in terms with no operational content whatsoever. One battalion commander, writing to his brother in the second week of July, describes spending an afternoon in a farm cellar while American guns worked over his regiment's positions. He writes that he counted the intervals between barrages and found no intervals. He writes that the guns seemed to be without number. He ends one paragraph with a sentence he set apart from the rest. "We have our artillery too. I have not heard it in 3 days." That observation recurs in different forms across the surviving correspondence. German officers in the Bocage could hear when their own guns were silent, and their guns were frequently silent in July 1944 for reasons unrelated to the quality of German artillerymen. The Allied air campaign against French rail and road infrastructure, running from April 1944 as part of the transportation plan, had degraded the supply lines feeding the Normandy front to a degree no operational adjustment could fully compensate for. German logistics moved at night and dispersed during daylight hours under constant threat of air attack. The 7th Army's War Diary records that corps artillery across the front was restricted to fewer than 40 rounds per gun per day on multiple dates in July, with resupply described as uncertain. American divisional artillery in the same period operated under expenditure authorizations that, on active days, ran to several hundred rounds per gun. The diary entry for July 14 notes that counter-battery requests from forward units are being prioritized, but that available ammunition precludes full response. A notation in a different hand below that entry, attributed by handwriting comparison to the Army artillery officer, records that the notation covers 11 separate missions that could not be fulfilled that day. He wrote nothing else on the page. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel addressed the arithmetic directly in his report to Army Group B on July 15, 1944, transmitted from his headquarters at La Roche-Guyon and now held at the Bundesarchiv. The report stated that the situation on the Army Group front was becoming operationally untenable because of Allied material superiority, that Allied air and artillery support had conferred an advantage that the quality of German infantry could not offset, and that the troops were fighting with exemplary steadiness under conditions that exceeded the limits of human endurance. He requested permission to discuss the strategic situation with Hitler directly. Rommel was wounded by a strafing attack 3 days after writing the report and did not command in the field again. In the days between that report and the opening of Operation Cobra on July 25, German formations holding the St. Lo sector continued to absorb American fire at rates their replacement systems could not compensate for. The 7th Army's strength returns for mid-July, portions of which survive in the captured records of the National Archives, show infantry regiments at 40 to 60% of authorized strength, with artillery and anti-tank assets reduced proportionally by counter-battery fire and air attack. The 2nd SS Panzer Division, committed to the front in mid-July, reported to Corps headquarters within a week that its reconnaissance battalion had been reduced to combat ineffectiveness by American artillery fire while moving into position before it had fired a shot at American infantry. That report is filed in the German Military Records Collection at the National Archives under Record Group 242. The division's commander noted that the losses had occurred entirely from indirect fire during daylight movement and recommended restricting all movement to darkness. His corps commander noted in reply that darkness was no longer reliably safe either. There was one further element those letters approached, but rarely named directly, because naming it would have required a kind of cold accounting that very few men writing to their wives or brothers were willing to put on paper. The American artillery system had not been designed to defeat the German army at St. Lo specifically. It had been designed to defeat any army that could be encountered on a European battlefield, and it had been designed before a single American soldier set foot in Normandy. The field manuals governing American Corps artillery operations, published in 1943 and distributed to every artillery headquarters in the European theater of operations, describe the massing procedures, the communication protocols, and the time-on-target calculation methods in sufficient detail that any reader with basic artillery training could replicate the system. German military attaches in Washington before the war had access to American doctrinal publications. The gap between understanding the doctrine as written and standing inside it as executed was the gap those officers were trying to describe with pencil and paper, and it was not a gap that any individual German commander in July 1944 had the means to close. The ground where these events took place is still there to walk. The town of St. Lo, taken by the American 29th Infantry Division on July 18, 1944, had been reduced by the fighting and the preceding bombardment to a condition that Correspondent Ernie Pyle, entering with the first troops, described as a city that appeared to have been compressed from above. The Cathedral of Notre Dame, whose tower survived in damaged form, still carries on its south face the repair line where post-war masonry meets the older stone below. The seam runs across the lower face of the tower at a height visible from the street. A visitor who looks for it can identify precisely where the war stopped and where the reconstruction began. The German military cemetery at Lockham, 14 kilometers northwest of Bayeux, holds 21,222 German dead from the Normandy campaign, among them men from the formations whose officers wrote the letters and filed the reports described here. The cemetery was designed after the war with flat basalt crosses and oak trees, a deliberate choice, distinct from the white stone rows of Allied cemeteries nearby. It sits lower in the Norman ground than those cemeteries, closer to the earth, and visitors who walked through both on the same afternoon noticed the difference without being instructed to look for it. A letter preserved in the regimental history of the 352nd Infantry Division was written by a Hauptmann in the second week of July. He told his wife he was not afraid of American soldiers. He had fought them in the hedgerows and found them capable, but not superior to his own men in that terrain. He told her to understand clearly what arrived before those soldiers, the thing that came first, before any American infantryman was in range of a German rifle. By the time American infantry reached his company's position, his men had already been through something, he said, he could not name, using any term that appeared in the German military vocabulary he had trained with. He asked her to have his children say a prayer, and said he did not think he needed to specify what the prayer was for. She would know. The Hauptmann was killed 3 days after the letter was dated. His company was overrun during the American advance following the Cobra preparation. The regimental history records his death at the end of a casualty list in a single line. His wife found the letter in a bundle tied with paper twine after the war and gave it to the regiment's Veterans Association in 1968. The association passed it to an archive in Kassel. The archive cataloged it in 1973. The regimental history's editor found it while preparing the 1983 volume, which means either the cataloging date is wrong or the editor saw the letter before it was formally processed. The history does not explain which. Some gaps in the record stay gaps. What the letters show, what the 7th Army War Diaries show, what Bärlein's testimony and Rommel's final field report show from their separate angles, is that the American artillery system at St. Lo, in July 1944, produced an effect that was entirely deliberate, constructed across 3 years of preparation, and without precedent for any German formation at the scale at which it operated. The time-on-target technique, the proximity fuse, the radio network connecting a forward observer in a hedgerow to every gun within range in under 2 minutes, the ammunition supply that permitted sustained fire without rationing. These were not improvised under pressure. They were built deliberately, documented in manuals, trained at stateside camps, and shipped across an ocean as a functioning system. The planning behind them predated the first shell fired at St. Lo by 3 years. The gap between reading the Doctrine and standing inside, it was the gap that German officers in Normandy tried to close with pencil and paper, writing home about something that the available language was not quite adequate to hold. Thank you for staying with this until the end. If what you heard here stayed with you, the other films on your screen carry the story forward. Subscribe if you haven't, and I'll see you in the next one.